We're continuing in our discussion about the world to come, the days of the Messiah, the resurrection, all the ideas related to what is the reward for being a good person. And we're following the discussion of Maimonides in his introduction to the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin. And before the Rambam continues telling us exactly what is Olam Haba, Maimonides says, first we have to understand something about how to read the words of the sages. When we talk about the Jewish tradition, of course, we speak about the Bible and the various verses and how they should be understood, how we understand their prophecies. But we talk about the oral Torah as well. The oral Torah canonized the discussion at the end and after the destruction of the Second Temple between the years 0 and 500 approximately. And the Rambam describes that there are three groups of people and their different ways of how they understand the words of the sages. Of course, much of the words of the sages deal with law, deal with halacha. But especially we have to focus in dealing with these issues of philosophy and understanding the world to come. We have to understand the allegorical parts, the parts of the words of the sages which are not halacha. They're called agadah or midrash. And how should we understand the words of the sages? Everything that they said, were they fact or were they parables? Were they something that must be understood literally, or can perhaps some of their words be understood allegorically? And here Maimonides gets a little angry at the first group of people who try to read the words of the sages. And out of great, great respect for the words of the sages, they say, it must be that everything that the sages said, Chazal said, of course it's true. And not only is it true, but it must be taken literally. And so even descriptions, the most far out, strange, miraculous, and weird descriptions and statements by the sages, out of veneration, out of their great respect for the sages, they say, well, this must be the truth. This must be the simple, literal meaning of the words which they stated is what they meant. And Maimonides says, they're trying to be very respectful, but they're actually bringing great disgrace upon the rabbis. Because many of their statements are, in essence, if you take them literally, they are ridiculous. They are impossibilities. And every fool would realize that the statement by the sages that says something which is impossible must be understood allegorically. And yet this group of people, because they want to be so careful about the honor of the sages, bring much disgrace upon them. Because they take their words too literally, and the result is that they make the sages look hilarious. They make the sages look like jokers. They make them look like people who are not wise and don't have any understanding at all, but saying all sorts of ridiculous and strange things. Which brings us to the second group. The second group, because they've heard so much of the words of the sages and they see these people that are taking them literally, they look at the sages and they say, these people can't be wise. They really are jokers. They don't keep that respect that the first group had and take their words out of context, but they say it must be that this is what the sages actually meant. And if they actually meant that, then they're not such sages. But they were silly, they were perhaps infantile, they said things which were not true, patently false, and therefore they deride the sages. They say that much of the Talmud, much of the Midrash can be thrown out, should be thrown out of the window, especially to the modern ear. Whatever doesn't make sense, it must be that these sages were really silly. They were primitive. They were stuck in an ancient world which had primitive beliefs, perhaps even pagan beliefs. And because they take the words of the sages literally, they deride them and they disgrace them and they pay no attention to the wisdom of the sages. The third group, the Rambam says, and this is unfortunately the smallest and select few, the people who realize these sages were very wise. When you read some of their writings, you see they were geniuses beyond what we could ever, each and every one of us could aspire to. There's tremendous wisdom. And so when they see some other statements of the sages, which raise an eyebrow, which seem to be impossible, and which might even be patently false, they say, wait, how does this fit together? If these sages are so smart, how could he say something so stupid? And the answer is very simple, the Rambam says. Whenever you have something which doesn't make sense, and you see it was stated by such a wise man, and somebody who you know and you recognize and you appreciate him because you've studied the Torah and you've studied his words and you appreciate the value of everything that this sage says. So when you see that he says something impossible, you must understand it as a mashal, as a parable. Perhaps there's an idea inside the statement, which when understood literally sounds ridiculous, actually is trying to convey a very important message. People who don't appreciate that, people who think that the words of the sages that are impossibilities, that are ridiculous, they don't understand how hard it is, Maimonides says, to convey complex ideas, to convey perhaps spiritual ideas, to convey ideas which are not to be taken literally, which are hard to describe. The sages did use parables. They used all sorts of methods of saying things which might, if you took them literally, sound ridiculous. But yet, if we study their words a little bit deeper, we understand that they were trying to tell us something. And this third group is the smallest, as we said, unfortunately. But this is the proper way to read the writings of the sages. Maimonides goes on to say that the following discussion, in which we're now going to embark upon, describing what is Olam Haba, what is the world to come, and how this fits in with the days of the Messiah and so forth, will not be tasty, will not be palatable to those members of Group 1 and Group 2. People who have too much respect for the sages, so much so that they misinterpret their words and take everything that they say literally, they will not enjoy the following explanation, Maimonides says. And of course, those people who think that anything the sages said that sounds out of this world must be thrown out and ridiculed, of course, they will not be able to participate in this discussion in which we're treating the words of the sages with great respect. So really, the following comments and this discussion is based on the principle of properly understanding the words of the sages. And hopefully, myself, yourself, and the group of the select few who do respect the words of the sages and want to understand the Jewish traditions with the proper worldview, with the big picture, will be able to appreciate and understand these ideas in the following discussion.